In this session, we're going to explore the postmodern corporation. I know you may have taken a course in corporate law or securities regulation in law school, but what I'm going to do is give you kind of a quick overview of some of the rules that are established for modern corporations, and then we're going to take a look at them a little later and see if they actually make any sense at all today, whether they're relevant, important, or in fact unnecessary. So let's first take a look at the some of the rules of the Modern Business Corporation Act, which is really the from the ABA, the framework for governing all corporations. I'm going to highlight only a couple of areas which relate to boards of directors, employee executives, and also some of the voting issues and the shareholder issues. And I'll call out a couple of the more salient points that we're going to discuss much later in much greater detail. So if we take a look at our readings, it's very interesting that they identify that what the rights, of course, and responsibilities are of the board of directors. And I just want to read a couple of sections, which I think will be very interesting later on when we discuss the fiduciary stewardship of the corporation and who they're fiduciaries and stewards of. Because this is one thing you'll see in this section, that they really don't define. They really don't define who they are responsible to. So in 6.24, the board of directors may authorize one or more officers to designate the recipients of rights, options, warrants, and other equity compensation awards. That is, the board of directors, of course, can provide stock options for the executives, and then they can also, it says, provide the number of rights, options, warrants, or other equity compensation. They can identify how much they want to give, but the officer who receives it is not allowed to designate his own rights and warrants to himself, which makes a lot of sense. We'll talk a little about the annual meeting too, because this is actually very funny. And think about it today, where there's millions of shares, people all around the world are stockholders or shareholders, or in most cases, 70 or 80 million Americans have their stock in Fidelities, the Vanguards, the American funds, the Merrills, and other mutual funds. But annual meeting. Unless directors are elected by written consent in lieu of an annual meeting as permitted by Section 704, a corporation shall hold a meeting of shareholders annually at a time stated or fixed in accordance with the bylaws, which is fascinating. Annual shareholder meetings may be held in and out of this state at the place stated or fixed in accordance with the bylaws. If no place is stated or fixed in accordance with the bylaws, annual meetings shall be held at the corporation's principal office. We're going to go over a little later the proxy at Oracle and the shareholder meeting. Goes on in terms of voting. Now, when was the last time in your pension plan you actually voted in a proxy for one of the maybe 100 corporations that you have fractional ownership of? After fixing a record date for a meeting, a corporation shall prepare an alphabetic list of names of all its shareholders who are entitled to notice of a shareholders meeting. Now, when was the last time you received a proxy based on a list from these shareholders? It must, of course, be available for inspection by any shareholder beginning 2 business days after notice of the meeting is given. And the corporation shall make the list of shareholders entitled to vote available at the meeting, and any shareholder or shareholder's agent or attorney is entitled to inspect the list. Tremendously interesting, because none of us who own shares or mutual funds ever go through this process. Let's talk about the board of directors, the requirements for and functions of the board of directors. 8.01. All corporate power shall be exercised by and under the authority of the board of directors of the corporation, and the business affairs and the affairs of the corporation shall be managed by and under the direction and subject to the oversight of its board of directors. Now let's talk about the oversight responsibilities of the board of directors. Now remember, in most cases, boards of directors meet maybe 4 times a year. They're compensated for that. A lot of these folks have absolutely no understanding or knowledge of what this corporation is all about. Many of them have special titles and have, very notable, presence in population in America. Some people are stars, some are other former CEOs of other companies. Some are heads of governments or 8 government agencies, but not necessarily know anything about the company itself. But in the case of a public corporation in 801, the board's oversight responsibility include business performance and plans, major risks to which the corporation is exposed, performance and compensation of senior officers, that's number 3, policies and practices to foster the corporation's compliance with law and ethical conduct, preparation of this is oversight responsibility, preparation of the corporation's financial statements, effectiveness of its internal controls. We're going to get back to internal controls later because it's never been shown that internal controls actually safeguard the assets of the corporation or actually have any value whatsoever in today's modern corporation. Adequate and timely information to directors arranging this. They work on the composition of the board and its committees, identify major risks to the corporations and others. What's very interesting, though, is it says that in the case of a public corporation, the oversight responsibility includes all these to the corporation, but it doesn't say who the stakeholders are of the corporation. And here's the standards of conduct. And let me ask you, if this is, when we go to fiduciary responsibility, is this the kind of responsibility that you would really want somebody to have, to be responsible for at the level and the depth that you'd want them to? Each member of the board of directors, when discharging the duties of a director, shall act in good faith, that's cool, in a manner the director reasonably believes to be in the best interests of the corporation. Notice, let me read this again. A manner a director believes to be in the best interest of the corporation never says who the stakeholders are of the corporation. What does it mean to really reasonably believe to be acting in the best interests of the corporation? Never really defined. The members of the board of directors or the committee of the board, when becoming informed in connection with their decision-making functions or devoting attention to their oversight function, shall discharge their duties with the care that a person in a like position would reasonably believe appropriate under similar circumstances. So would you ever put somebody in charge of your finances with the care that a person in a like position would reasonably believe appropriate under the best circumstances? I'm not sure you would want that person in managing your finances. And then this is another one, F. A director is entitled to rely in accordance with subsection D and E on one or more officers or employees of the corporation whom the director reasonably believes to be reliable and competent in the functions performed or the information, opinions, reports, or statements provided. That's fascinating because the CEO, many times of the board, is also the employee of the corporation. So basically, you're believing yourself as reliable and competent for the functions performed. But notice you never really say, other than you're working for the corporation, what that really means. So let's talk a little then about the officers of the corporation. A corporation has the officers, this is 8.4, described by its bylaws or appointed by the board of directors in accordance with the bylaws. And what are these standards of conduct? Well, an officer, when performing in such capacity, has one, the duty to act in good faith with the care that a person in a like position would reasonably exercise under similar circumstances. We've heard that before. That's what the board is supposed to be doing. That's what the same person is doing as a officer. Or in a manner the officer reasonably believes to be in the best interest of the corporation. But they didn't really say what the stakeholders are of the corporation and what their best interests are. So you have this amorphous, you have this board of directors, and you have the officers acting in a capacity that they reasonably believe to be in the best interests of the corporation. And in fact, you'll see that what that really means in a lot of the corporations, they're basically what the officers and the board of directors are reasonably acting in the best interest of themselves. So let's go on to, so that is the Model Business Corporation Act. And if you notice, they don't talk about shareholder investors, they don't talk about employees, they don't talk about any supply chain issues, environmental issues, social issues, community issues. All they talk about is acting in the best interest of the corporation. Now, diary forward, let's take a look at the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, the 33 and 34 acts. Admirably, these were critical acts of their time because it was mentioned that before the Depression hit, that in the 20s, a good 50% of the companies that were publicly traded were apparently bogus, and there were no audits done on them, and it was a freewheeling society of apparently a lot of fraudsters. Enter the 33 and 34 acts, and let's see what this mission is, and let's see what this mission has to do with corporations and the responsibility to the corporation. The mission of the Securities Acts, you have this in your handout, of 33 and 34, is to protect investors. Now, if you notice, the Model Business Corporation Act never talked about investors. Maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, facilitate capital formation. And they go on to say that the laws and rules that govern the securities industry in the United States derive from a simple and straightforward concept. All investors, whether large institutions or private individuals, should have access to basic facts about an investment prior to buying it, and so long as they hold it. The SEC oversees key participants in the securities world, including securities exchanges, securities, brokers and dealers, investment advisors, and mutual funds. And here we have to talk a little about mutual funds because the mutual fund industry is actually self-regulated, and it's rare that I've seen enforcement actions against mutual funds. Instead, I've seen a lot of enforcement actions against registered investment advisors that may hold other people's securities. But generally, I haven't seen enforcement actions literally over the last couple of years against mutual funds. But then here, the SEC is concerned primarily with promoting the disclosure of important market-related information, maintaining fair dealing, and protecting against fraud. Crucial to the SEC's effectiveness in this area is its enforcement authority. And each year, the SEC brings hundreds of civil enforcement actions against individuals and companies for violations of the Securities Act. Typical infractions include insider trading, accounting fraud, and providing false and misleading information about securities and companies that issue them. It's very interesting that the SEC uses the criminal law provisions of the Securities Acts of 33 and 34 to exact civil fines against the corporations that have been found to mistake their financials and cause some fraud. The really interesting thing here, though, is that the directors and officers of the corporation don't disgorge the money from their own pockets, except we'll see one that was forced to just recently. But 99% of the time, it's the corporation, that is, the shareholders, that actually bear the brunt of the penalty. So, in fact, the fraudster, who could be the CEO or the head of the board of directors or the president of the company, does bad deeds, he's not thrown in jail or she's not thrown in jail. But the corporation pays a fine, the financials are restated, the stock price goes down. There's some strong statistics to that effect. And the investors lose money. I'm not exactly sure this was the intention of the Securities Act. And clearly it doesn't square well with the Model Business Corporation Act.